It's fun to be back at the Austin chapter, always fun to visit. I did move to Colorado a couple years ago and miss this chapter. But even more a humbling privilege to be given the opportunity to speak, especially on a topic that's dear to my heart and one I hope to do a doctoral dissertation on. That being said, I'll likely be barely scratching the surface today. This research is fairly new to me, but have me back in a couple years into the doctorate work and should be more refined. So you'll notice I changed. I realized going into this and in my prep that the term de-evolution just did not set well. Since we were not evolved in the first place, and actually that idea is sort of what has set us up for a lot of what I'll be talking about today. I changed the title a bit. We were originally created in the image of our Creator as fully human. So since the fall, we have spiraled, but I'll be addressing the dehumanization in our culture, the blatant examples of that we have in our culture today. And here we go. So first, let's define dehumanization. So Chad Woodruff and Larry Stevens, in their book, The Neuroscience of Empathy, Compassion, and Self-Compassion, have given two types of dehumanization, and these really can overlap, have fuzzy borders. Animalistic dehumanization is most associated with disgust, and is said to occur under conditions in which one views another as lacking the key qualities, whatever those may be, that make one uniquely human. And mechanistic dehumanization refers more to the denial of warmth and to attribution of cold and superficial characteristics. So we'll go into more defining these as we go. But what the authors note is dehumanization leads to empathy erosion. That left to simmer leads to self-justification of moderate to severe cruelty towards others. And so I would wager that we all, in some ways in our hearts and minds, may have dehumanizing thoughts to others, whether it's someone that's on opposite end of a political spectrum, or even someone that just is a constant feeling of discouragement in our own lives. But what I'm addressing today is that blatant cruelty that we see in culture due to this dehumanization, this empathy erosion that's been left to simmer. So animalistic dehumanization likely was a part of evolutionary theory before Darwin, but Darwin really established the evolutionary theory by giving a mechanism, natural selection. And in his Descent of Man, he writes about just how we've just evolved over eons of time, just like the animals, and therefore, like the creatures, we are subject to all the same natural laws. Darwin even sought to use his theory to classify races of men along an evolutionary spectrum. One of his correspondents, Ernst Haeckel, made these drawings to illustrate this evolutionary spectrum that Darwin had set up. And so you'll see, and this actually appeared in countless biology textbooks in the early 20th century. So you'll see the progression here of the lower primates to the highest human. And if you'll notice my arrows, the blue arrows indicating that gap between the highest human and the lowest human, and the orange arrows indicating the gap between the lowest human and the highest ape. And notice by intention that this gap between the lowest human and the highest ape is much narrower than that between the highest human and the lowest human. And Darwin, in his classification of various races of man, decided that the lowest human was that of the Australian Aboriginal. So you see here Darwin has humans depicted as just a part of this evolutionary spectrum, really same par with animals, the animal kingdom. So what does this set us up for? So we have animal rights activists. Wesley Smith, who's an American author and lawyer and is considered the foremost apologist in human exceptionalism, distinguished between animal welfare and animal rights. So animal welfare is that responsibility that we take to care for our domestic animals as well as the appropriate treatment of animals that we slaughter for food. Whereas animal rights is that pushing that barrier to, well, if we're all in the same evolutionary spectrum, then all creatures along this spectrum should have the same rights as any other. And you see this pictured in the slogan that PETA, so PETA is People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and in their slogans for one campaign, they pictured the mistreatment or the slaughtering of animals as equal to that mistreatment, slaughtering of humans at Auschwitz. PETA founder Igor Newkirk has said, when it comes to pain, love, joy, loneliness, and fear, a rat is a pig, is a dog, is a boy. Each one values his or her life and fights the knife. So in other words, any creature that experiences pain should have a right to life, whatever evolutionary part of the spectrum they're on. Another post in a PETA blog says this: only prejudice allows us to deny others the rights that we expect to have for ourselves. Whether it's based on race, gender, sexual orientation, or species, prejudice is morally unacceptable. If you wouldn't eat a dog, why eat a pig? Dogs and pigs have the same capacity to feel pain, but it's prejudice based on species that allows us to think of one animal as a companion and the other as dinner. So I'm just going to show a 1-minute video that really gives a picture of how animal rights activists see us as all one with species in the animal kingdom.
We are all the same in all the ways that matter. It doesn't matter what we look like, how old we are, what language we speak, or who we love. It doesn't matter if we have fur or feathers or fins, the length of our nose or the number of legs. We're not different in any important way. We all have thoughts and feelings. We all feel love and pain and loneliness and joy. We can all understand, but we are not always understanding. We experience ourselves as separate from the rest, but none of us deserves to be treated with less respect. Our task must be to break free from prejudice and to see ourselves in everyone else.
Okay, so to them, inside everybody is a person, creature and human alike. Okay, and then there's mechanistic dehumanization. So mechanistic dehumanization sort of takes a mechanical, robotic view of humans. We're very much just the conglomeration of actions determined by the firing of our neurons, reducible to materialistic explanation, void of soul, of free consciousness. So this is a mechanistic dehumanization approach. And examples of these, or areas where we see this, is transhumanism, for instance. Transhumanism is an area where the idea to push humans beyond normal human limits, and I'll touch more on this in a minute. But ironically, transhumanism, it's been written that it really leads to an anti-humanism, because what it does is it separates, makes that gap further between the haves and the have-nots as far as cultural standards for cognitive and physical abilities. And it leads to a despising of the millions of others across all races and cognitive physical abilities that don't jump on the bandwagon of this technology to further human performance. And so it leads really to an anti-humanism. Gene editing is another area. So gene editing is the ability of scientists to change someone's DNA. And while this could be helpful in a single gene disorder, it really pushes ethical concerns when it comes to germline editing or changing human traits, enhancing human traits. And then we have synthetic embryos. So I'll touch on these in subsequent slides. So now I'm going to touch on examples of where we see dehumanization blatantly played out in our culture today. So Margaret Sanger is the founder of Planned Parenthood, and she was actually a racist and a staunch supporter of eugenics. So eugenics was a movement in the early half of the 20th century in which there was a forced sterilization of over 60,000 Americans. We don't hear much about this today. It actually stemmed from Nazi Germany. So Hitler was a very strong follower of Darwinian evolution. The idea of survival of the fittest, he was seeking to create a perfect race. And in this, Hitler began a forced sterilization of those he considered feeble-minded and many who were experienced cognitive disabilities, physical disabilities. And after this forced sterilization began gassing these people before he was even gassing the Jews. But this influence came to the States and was prevalent in American medical society as well as universities. And like I said, there was this forced sterilization of people deemed by others to be feeble-minded. But many of these people appeared normal in society. So you have this, they're not meeting someone else's standards. And in the words of Margaret Sanger, she complained openly of the cost and burden on taxpayers to support the breeding of the feeble-minded. Her grandson and current leaders in Planned Parenthood share her sentiments. Sanger herself warned of the dangers inherent in the very idea of humanitarianism and altruism, dangers which have today, in her words, produced their full harvest of human waste, of inequality and inefficiency. And you'll see later a quote by Darwin, how this very much parallels Darwin's thesis in his Descent of Man. Alexander Sanger, excuse me, Sanger's grandson and current chair of the Planned Parenthood Council champions abortion as a practice that evolved through Darwinian natural selection to help humans survive. He makes this point clear. Humanity has evolved to take conscious control of reproduction and has done so in order to survive. He declares we cannot repeal the laws of natural selection. Nature does not let every life form survive. Humanity uniquely and to its benefit can exercise some dominion over this process. Wesley Smith in an article said that categorizing humans into valuable and non-valuable, depending on an outsider's point of view, become just small contrivances toward using these humans for their organs, now for other humans to survive. So not only is there a dehumanization, setting a standard from an outsider's point of view to another's life, rather than having inerrant human dignity because we have life. But there's also this now utilitarian look at humans to those who are unwanted to harvest for their organs. It's even noted that a Planned Parenthood executive boasted of being able to place forceps in such a way to crush a fetus while preserving the organs. So, and now there's drive because of this organ harvesting, there's a push to get legislation to allow a later abortion later on in pregnancy and to encourage women to carry more long-term before an abortion so that organs are at a point where they're more viable for harvesting. And even to the point of trying to legalize infanticide, changing it to term it a just and after-birth abortion. So again, the organs would be more viable for harvesting. Another area is doctor-assisted suicide. So Hal Malchow was a well-known political consultant, and he experienced having a mother who was overcome with dementia, and he felt that she was a burden to family and society, and he didn't want to be the same, so he had himself tested to see if he carried genetic markers for Alzheimer's disease himself, which the test came out positive. So he determined at that point that once he ever showed some cognitive decline, that he would put an end to his life so as not to be a burden on others or on society. And so later on in life, he began to show early signs of cognitive decline. He booked a ticket to Switzerland, where doctor-assisted suicide is allowed in those early stages of cognitive decline, and had an end put to his life. And the Washington Post carried this article, and what the Post indicated, they built this up as some heroic action that Mao Chao did by not allowing himself to become a burden to others. And the article strongly indicated that for someone to begin experiencing cognitive decline, they would be a burden on others in society and should follow the same kind of patterns. So here you see a real just idea of elimination of those, again, that would not fit certain standards in society. Even in the Netherlands now, you can get yourself into a hospice and request palliative care, even if you aren't experiencing any sort of decline in health, but just want to end your life, and through starving yourself to death so that you can receive palliative care for a voluntary stop eating and drinking. But hospices, this is not the purpose. The purpose of a hospice is to foster quality of life in those who are significantly declining and cannot help it, not to foster a culture of death across all abilities and disabilities. So another area of dehumanization is radical environmentalism. And radical environmentalists think that humans are a cancer to the planet. And so you have the likes of Sir David Attenborough, the famous narrator of animal shows for the BBC. He says that humans are a plague on the earth. Professor Eric Pianka, right here at UT Austin, claims that the planet would be better off if 90% of the human population were eliminated. And you see slogans at the marches of the radicals, such as this one, "Eat people, not animals." I really wonder which of these activists will step forward to be the first to eat or either be eaten. But think about it this way. This is how I think about it. A house that's lived in gets untidy, becomes dirty. But it takes those same hands that have created the mess to put the mess back together in an orderly fashion. The house may not ever be as perfect as it was as a new build, but takes those same hands to put it back together. If people were eliminated from that house because of their mess, then the house would just become a dilapidated, deteriorated structure. I mean, you see these abandoned places along roadsides when you take road trips. So the answer to bringing a planet back to some order or to rescuing some area of the planet that has spiraled is not to get rid of the hands that we need to, and the minds to put into it to restore it. And we also have, ironically, economists that are saying our economy is in significant trouble in the future because people have stopped having as many children as they used to have. And China's in dire straits with theirs because of this very same thing. So we need life to bring life to our planet. Okay, and I'm just going to touch on these briefly. Animal hybrids. So in the lab, it's been ongoing to create these chimeras of humans and chimps, dogs and humans, rabbits and humans. And it's been strongly suggested by psychology professors such as David Barish that if we can show humans that humans and animals can interbreed, this would make it more clear how we're just on the same evolutionary spectrum. And therefore, maybe we'll not think of ourselves as so special and unique as to cause the mistreatment of animals. But authors such as Richard Weikart and others contend that actually this idea in the past that we're all on the same scale as animals has led to a demoting of humans, not necessarily a better treatment of animals, but it's led to much of what I've already mentioned. This idea, well, if we're just animals, then we can treat animals, we can treat humans as we have done animals. And so, but also not only does it do this, but it causes this push for animal rights, They should have the same rights as we do. But it's also, other areas have suggested that, well, then also whatever goes on in the animal kingdom should be allowed in society. So if you have polygamy in the animal kingdom, we should have legislation that makes it legal for polygamy in human society. So really it leads to just this whole animalistic idea of how life should be done. If anyone remembers the Terry Schiavo case back in the late 90s, early 2000s, you have this young woman of 26 who had a massive heart attack, ended up in a coma state. And there was a struggle over Terry by her husband and her parents. And her husband wanting to remove the feeding tube, and which it was removed at some point in those years and may have diminished her ability to survive, and then her parents wanting to preserve her life. And at one point they were not even allowed to go in and sort of nurture her cracking lips, for instance, because the medical community had seen her as in this what they termed a vegetable state, and therefore separating or justifying this neglect of her as a human. Well, a Family Guy episode carried a very mocking degrading of a fictional Terry Schiavo character, in which one of the characters in the episode said, "She's a vegetable," and others hopped around saying, "We hate vegetables." Her brains were pictured as mashed potatoes poured into a bowl. So you had this very degrading going on of her character. But the creator of Family Guy suffered no consequence from this at all. However, you could see if this were done to another race or about another situation, how there could be consequences. But the creator of Family Guy actually hosted the Academy Awards not long after the episode. So you have this dehumanization, this view, as bioethicists think that these persons in an unconscious state would be termed non-persons. And again, it allows them to justify mistreatment of a human life. The New England Journal of Medicine advocates for harvesting organs from the cognitively devastated before they die. And since this article, this is going on. So an organ donor who is brain dead may have their organs removed before their heart actually stops beating without family members being able to have a word. Because in order to harvest particular organs, they should be procured from the body before the heart stops beating. Otherwise, they will not be useful. And so you have someone determining by whatever standards if a person is fully dead or not in order to harvest the organs while the heart is still beating. There are even medical professionals who will revive someone who's dead, who's an organ donor, will try to resuscitate the heartbeat in order to procure viable organs. And mind you, that's not resuscitating heartbeat for life for this person, but rather to harvest these organs. So again, another real utilitarian view. The telling part is that with a brain dead person, before they procure the organs, they will give them consciousness blockers so that their body does not respond to pain. So on the one hand, as I mentioned earlier, have animal rights activists who say any creature experiencing pain should have a right to life. On the other hand, you have humans. The other humans want to harvest organs from, they give them medication should they experience pain with this going on. So just great dehumanization. Another area is gene editing, as I mentioned earlier. And so we have this even with just from conception. So currently, someone who maybe cannot have a baby or wants to have a baby just like some standard that they are seeking, they can go to an egg and sperm bank and look and see the background, the genetics of the egg and sperm. And these are marketed. And so the story is carried in the Washington Post. And this is the remarks they make on it. Fertility companies freely admit that specimens from attractive donors go fast, but it's intelligence that drives the pricing. Many companies charge more for donors with a graduate degree. Talent sells too. One cryobank, Family Creations, which has offices in LA, Atlanta, Austin, and other large cities, notes that a 23-year-old egg donor excels in calligraphy, singing, modeling, metal art sculpting, painting, drawing, shading, and clay sculpting. A 29-year-old donor excels in softball, tennis, writing, and dancing. So you have this marketing go on to put together a baby that maybe the parents will feel more desirous about having. But this is also moving more into this gene editing. So currently gene editing is legal only for tests for improving, such as if there's a disease found, positive markers for that. But there is potential and there is ideas moving into this gene editing to have a designer baby according to what parents may want athletic-wise, beauty-wise, intelligent-wise. And so another article quotes this. Dr. David King, director of Human Genetics Alert, warns that CRISPR, which is a gene editing technique, could create this form of consumer eugenics in which people choose the cosmetic characteristics and abilities of their children and enhance them to perform better than other people's children. So you have this competition amongst children before they're hardly out of the gate from conception. I thought that athletic recruiting was taking place at such young ages nowadays. I had a friend tell me the other day that they've got a family member in 8th grade going to a softball competition in which university scouts were present. And I was thinking as I was putting this together, how long will it be before you have university scouts, sitting in a room with a mother who's just found out she's pregnant? So you've got this gene editing for designer babies. So again, not valuing life for life, the inherent value and dignity that we have. And then synthetic embryos. So what are synthetic embryos and why? So synthetic embryos scientists are able to generate these synthetic embryos from natural human embryos. When fertilization takes place, you have the egg and sperm come together, and then there's a sudden multiplication of cells to create this ball of cells. And that ball becomes a hollow ball of cells. Within the hollow ball of cells, you have an inner cell mass. This is the blastocyst, and that inner cell mass will become the embryo proper. And then there's a perimeter of cells called the trophoblast around that. And that trophoblast becomes the structures, the anchoring structures that help the blastocyst implant into the womb for nourishment of that embryo. And so what researchers or scientists have been able to do is take cells out of that inner cell mass that's that human embryo to generate a synthetic embryo. And these synthetic embryos at the moment are not very similar to natural embryos. They may be missing organs, just not very similar. But as science progresses, they are becoming more similar to natural embryos. So Dr. Fuzz-Rana of Reasons to Believe addresses the ethics behind this. One is they have a limited usefulness as models. So as I mentioned, they're not fully similar to natural embryos, and therefore any treatments, experiments done on these would not have necessarily the same consequences. And the reason why they're using synthetic embryos is they're trying to get around the ethics that regulate the use of natural human embryos. Natural human embryos are difficult to study in the womb, but in the lab they only survive up to about 14 days, and at which point there are laws that say that researchers must either destroy, freeze, or implant those embryos. And so as these synthetic embryos become more similar to natural embryos as science progresses, bioethicists say they must fall under these same legal laws. There's a proposed use for reproduction of these synthetic embryos in order to possibly use for harvesting organs, but there are laws currently against that. But then it all still boils down to a process. In this process, there is a destruction of natural human embryos. So Wesley Smith addresses this in a podcast, and he says that over the couple decades in which there's been these arguments around the ethics of embryonic stem cell research, there really has been no clinically approved study that has been set as useful for research. Whereas there's been a lot of progress in the area of adult stem cells where they can take skin cells and generate pluripotent stem cells, and that has been proven successful in studies. So why push these ethical barriers to continue with experimenting on embryos? And then finally, a final category I'll talk about today is transhumanism. So as I mentioned earlier, transhumanism is that desire to push humans beyond normal human limits. There are other categories, though, that don't seem to go along with that. But the main thrust in transhumanism is to be able to hook up someone's mind to a computer. And there's this idea that eventually humans will merge with AI in the singularity, and this being able to hook up our minds to computers will allow for this eternal life scenario in which we can live out the imaginations that we desire for our abilities. This hardly seems alongside reality. For one, we are immaterial beings. It's a very materialistic look at humans, again, denying that we are immaterial. And Dr. Robert Marks addresses this in his book, Non-Computable You. You cannot upload the immaterial, the non-computable, the non-algorithmic to a computer and have it be the same. And so this hardly seems like viable reality. But the transhumanists have their own Bill of Rights. So Article 10 says that sentient entities agree to uphold morphological freedom, the right to do with one's physical attributes or intelligence whatever one wants to, so long as it does not harm others. But I hardly see this to be the case. As I mentioned earlier, they've noted that transhumanism really leads to an anti-humanism, and we see what happens when there's the distaste or the despising of certain humans by other humans. And so I hardly see that that would not allow harm to others. Article 18 states that societies of the present and future should afford all sentient entities sufficient basic access to wealth and resources to sustain the basic requirements of existence in a civilized society and function as a foundation for pursuits of self-improvement. So basically what they're saying is that every person should have the right to, whether it's in denial of their biological reality, they should be supported. Whatever changes we want in our bodies should be supported emotionally and resourcefully in society. But we're seeing this take place in the transgender movement because what one wishes in denial of their biological reality, they can have done to their bodies, even to the point where it may cause harm. And Wesley Smith argues or inquires in an article he wrote, how far are we then from transableism? So because transgender gets a lot of political rap, there's support in that for bending to people's wishes and having surgeries or even causing harm to bodies that may change them to what people want in denial of reality. But transableism is a body dysmorphic wish by some people that have this issue that they feel like they should be disabled, that they should have limbs removed or their spinal cord cut. This is a very real condition. And there's been a push to legalize the medical community to perform these surgeries as well. But because it's not as highly politicized, we do still have laws preventing this from happening. But it's another condition in which someone wants to change their physical shape to fit wishes that are in their heads. So for transhumanism, there's a friar, Zachariah Lynch, who says this: based on its grandparent, Darwinism, transhumanism views humanity as a biochemical algorithm, as it does all biological life. It teaches humanity's own creation of electronic algorithms, such as computers and AI, will surpass humanity itself. This is known as singularity. The barriers between animals and machines will collapse, which means the current barriers will be transcended and biological life will merge with AI. So Halidia will be able to continue to deny reality for the wishes that we imagine. Author Peter Biles writes, "We store our knowledge, our memories, and even our relationships in our phones and tablets, and are thereby losing our ability to think, remember, and love without the aid of the machine. The transhumanists want to incorporate that horrifying vision into a more integrated system in which human intelligence and relationship will be entirely irrelevant." So again, a real materialistic view of humans. C.S. Lewis put it this way, before we got this far entrenched into transhumanism. "There is something which unites magic and applied science while separating both from the wisdom of earlier ages. For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem had been how to conform the soul to reality, and the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. For magic and applied science alike, now the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men." So Wesley Smith says that our vocabulary is very important. So we can start at the very surface level by being careful what vocabulary we use that's dehumanizing. So for instance, when I referred to the Terry Schiavo case and people who are in a brain dead state, the term vegetable is used. And in using terminology such as vegetable or persistent vegetative state, there's this distancing that justifies the neglect of a human life. Why not use persistent unconscious state to retain that human value even in our speak about another human life? Abortion clinics refuse to use the term baby, but use the term fetus instead, again to keep a distancing to justify what is actually going on. I experienced this myself when my third pregnancy. I had a massive hemorrhage as a miscarriage, and so was in the hospital. And the nurse there, when I passed the 12-week fetus, she showed it to me and said, "Here's the tissue that you passed." So a very dehumanizing point. That was my child, my baby, who would have someday been one that I could hold, and I will see someday. Euthanasia, even people that propose or are proponents for euthanasia think they should change the term because death in it. And having the term death doesn't necessarily invoke a lot of support. The Hemlock Societies changed their name to Compassion and Choices in order to gain more support for their assisted death campaigns. So Smith says we should be wary of words that serve as honey to make the hemlock go down. So if we want to, just in very simple ways, push back against dehumanization, we can do this with our vocabulary. Smith has a longer quote. "Other more encompassing means of automation are advancing faster than we can adjust to the changes they create. I worry about the threat posed by self-driving cars to wisecracking cabbies, entrepreneurial Uber contractors, and even more so about the impact automated trucks will have on long haulers whom, not too long ago, we romanticized as highway cowboys. Robots will soon be cooking our fast food, perhaps even replacing our servers. Transhumanists promote radical solipsism, pushing the fantasy that we can upload our minds into computers and live forever. Talk about an antiseptic existence. Euthanasia is increasingly advocated, I've thought, to put the sick out of our misery. At the very least, corroding the human bond that forms when we care for people as they die. There's even a burgeoning sex doll industry that promises customers greater pleasure than human intercourse with increasingly sophisticated mannequins, all without the mess of emotional commitment and self-sacrifice that ideally accompanies intimacy." So you see how there's this dehumanization, this breaking, this separation of human bonds in many areas that builds our bonding together. So I've talked about the examples, the consequences in culture of a dehumanization, this empathy erosion that leads to this cruel treatment and neglect. But how did we get here? So I'm just going to touch on a few points that particularly in our culture today have had input. One is Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon was considered the father of modern scientific method and had a lot of influence in early science. He pushed the idea that knowledge, we gain all knowledge based on purely empirical facts without reason to invoke the spiritual or philosophical. But this has really ushered in naturalism and materialism as objective realities. Baconianism also has infiltrated evangelicalism and moral philosophies, resulting in the treatment of moral philosophy as a science rather than founded on scriptural revelation, again ushering in philosophical naturalism and the secularization of the American university. There's also with Newton, so Newton had a mechanical idea of the universe and his laws of cause and effect. But the author J. Richards addresses this, that Newtonian mechanism was a far cry from this Baconianism. For Newton was a strong believer in the intervention of God in nature. Richards writes that Newton more likely held a view of mechanism that aligned with the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition, which is a mechanical natural philosophy would be one that treats certain natural objects as machines, as various parts or systems arranged to perform a certain function. Further, a machine can be a constructed thing, whether material or immaterial, an assemblage of parts that transmit forces, motion, and energy one to another in a predetermined manner. Predetermined has to do with foresight. So here, as it was mentioned just a little bit ago, foresight is this top-down look and giving things purpose in a predetermined manner. Secondarily, it can refer to a living organism or one of its functional systems. Mechanism in the materialistic viewpoint is more of a reductionism, so dismissing the purpose of a whole, whereas mechanism, as Newton and others would have held to, best fits is this top-down approach. The pieces of any machine become a wonder of accomplishment when they're integrated into the purpose of the whole. And I'm sure you've heard the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And this is what we observe in life and living systems. And then we have Darwinian evolution. And Darwinian evolution and other evolutionists hold to is that the parts of the parts have evolved over a gradual period of time through unguided processes and through accidental that's brought about what we see. And in humans also, and just an emergence or an evolution of consciousness, which materialists seek to explain as a reduction product of the parts. Though evolutionary ideology did not start with Darwin, Darwin, in the words of Richard Dawkins, made it possible to become an intellectually fulfilled atheist, and proposing natural selection as a mechanism, and as in his writing in The Descent of Man, Darwin set a course for dehumanization through the explanation of the natural world in purely materialistic terms. And then with AI, we have a twist. Because AI seems to be human, appears to be certain, it has the result of paradoxically making actual humans seem less so. So, for instance, you have the leaning on ChatGPT for some writing assignments, or other areas where AI could be used as a tool but becomes overused because we lose our confidence because we have these technological tools. I had a couple students try to use AI for writing a paper that I had assigned last year, and our plagiarism detector picked up. One of the guys used it 100% AI. And I read his paper, and it was not a human creativity. It was definitely truncated sentences and a lack of coherence. You hear the downfalls of this. And while it is improving, it's still, as Dr. Robert Marks addresses again in his book, Non-Computable You, it will never have the creativity that humans have. AI can only use the algorithms fed to it by humans. And all these things play significant roles in the dehumanization in culture. But in the words of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, I think is the most key point, men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. So here's a quote from Darwin's Descent of Man that sums it up, this entrenched ideology. With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated. And those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. There's reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands who from a weak constitution would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. It is surprising how soon a want of care or care wrongly directed leads to the degeneration of a domestic race. But excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. So we'll wrap this up. We see the consequences in culture. We see some things that have played a factor in getting us there. But is there any hope? Is there any way that we can, even in our lives and our circles, try to turn the tide of a dehumanizing of others? And so where can we go from here? In her book, Total Truth, Nancy Pearcey addresses the fact-value split. And this is what we've seen. This was initially illustrated by Francis Schaeffer as a two-story building. So you have the facts as an underlying foundation that bind everyone, and then values would be the upper story. But in our culture, particularly in postmodernism culture, has been a twist to truth. Whereas with these scientific ideologies, the facts, we've only been allowed through Baconianism to accept only the empirical. So we've got society on this shaky ground, this house built on sand, with taking out Christian values, objective truth, out of that foundation. And where values, truth values, are seen as relativistic. Your truth is your truth, mine is mine, and that's what we're left with and considered more in the irrational realm. So we must recapture the foundations of truth in a personal creator. The Duke of Argyll, Chancellor of the University of St. Andrews in 1852, 7 years before Darwin's publication of The Origin of Species, said that if the true meaning of nature and history is not recognized, then a false one will be invented. And that's what we've seen with naturalism and materialism. But this has also, we must be careful, been fostered by evangelicalism, especially since the revivals. There's been a split between an emotional conversion experience at the heart of religion, which is the upper story, and a narrow technical utilitarian reason of dealing with this world. So even in these circles, there's been fostered this split. And this is noted by historian Douglas Sloan. So we need to follow the intelligent design movement and challenge Baconian philosophy that knowledge is based solely on the empirical without reference to any metaphysical, rejecting Christian beliefs as setting one into a biased realm, while naturalists are given different rules of operation. We need to restore the Christian worldview to the lower story of objective truth. Romans 1:20 says that humans know God instinctively by the world he has created. The Christian worldview is the only one that makes sense of the experiential and does not deny it. We, in fact, cannot even trust our own thinking and conclusions under a naturalistic worldview. Even Darwin doubted that a mind brought about by unguided processes and chance could be trusted. So I began this talk saying that we did not evolve. We were created in the image of a creator who created us as fully human to begin with. And this we've, of course, spiraled since the fall. So what can we do to try to be more fully human in our own lives and to set examples and to try to influence those around us? Well, we can look to the perfect human, Jesus Christ. And I took some examples out of Scripture where Christ speaks to being fully human. The Beatitudes, for instance. Blessed are the poor in spirit. This is a far cry from the cultural desire to make ourselves into gods through the transhumanist approach. Those who mourn, this is a far cry from sitting next to the bedside of someone that's suffering from ill health or someone that's suffering from some decline. The meek, the merciful, peacemakers, pure in heart, those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, these are the ones that Christ says will inherit the earth. Philippians 2, who Jesus, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing. So here you have, ironically, Christ, who's fully God and fully human, had every right to display God-like qualities while he was here on earth, and yet emptied himself, even to, that verse goes on, to obedience to the cross in order to redeem us so we will be fully human again one day. And ironically, you've got men who have no right, no exhibition of God-like characteristics, who seek to make themselves into God. And then the greatest commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, strength. This is what gives the health to love our neighbor as ourselves and to live in a way of being fully human in our own and towards others. Charles Hard says, the distinctive element in Darwinism is not natural selection, but the denial of design or purpose. The denial of design in nature is virtually the denial of God. That's it.
All right. That felt very Orwellian.
Oh.
So now I'm totally depressed.
I was trying to give you hope at the
Thank
end.
you.
Sorry.
So you have time for questions, hopefully.
Yeah.
So real quick, 2 rules. First rule is please ask a question. First of all, David has a microphone and I have a microphone. So if you do have a question, raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you so everybody can hear what your question is. But please make sure that you ask a question, that you don't just ramble on and on and on and tell us what you think about the subject. If you need to set up your question, please do so, but please be respectful to other people who also have questions, and please ask your question. Second thing is that I'm the president. I own this place. I rule it. I get to ask the first question. So, the Declaration of Independence talks about how all men are created equal, with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? But it justifies that by saying that we are endowed by our Creator. Okay, so it takes a very theological foundation for this idea of personhood. But our nation is going through secularization. It's becoming less and less theological and much more secular. And the problem with that is it's moving from objective morality to subjective morality. And with subjective morality, you can just draw your lines, your moral lines, wherever you want to. So my question is, now that we're sort of in more of a secular culture, how do you at the end, you gave a very Christian response. How do you deal with other people who don't respect Christianity, who don't respect the Bible? How do you maintain that personhood in a secular audience who's willing to just draw their lines wherever they want?
Good question. And the next one. So for that, yes, because I know we are, not that I expect everyone in here to be a believer, but we're in a Christian setting. And so I wanted to bring in hope at the end, that we do have an example of what it means to be fully human, and we do have life illustrated, how we can live in this culture today. But the secular environment, that's why I pointed out that fact-value split, and that importance to return to we can call it a Christian worldview, or we can pursue in other ways, but those values, those objective truths, if we can, on our own, become more educated ourselves in how to address objective truth with a culture that's very much bent on relativistic truth, that draws the fuzzy lines for their morals and moral philosophy, so as to allow for things like this to happen in culture. If we can, on our own and in our circles that we are in, try to strengthen ourselves in those foundations of objective truth so that we can have a voice, even just in the circles that we rub shoulders with in the workplace. It doesn't mean that we need to all stand up and be some political loudspeaker, but just being more entrenched in how does objective truth fit into a foundation and culture, and how can we address that and explain that in those terms to those that don't hold to the Christian view. And that's what I hope to do further with a doctoral dissertation is, because I will study this in a secular setting, a secular university, but to show maybe where studies have shown or where there has been examples of how objective truth foundations fit reality and fit a more thriving cultural society than the shaky foundations in an evolutionary theory. Is that like that? Okay.
Thank you, Amy. My name is David. I appreciate your message. You stimulated my thinking here this morning.
Okay.
I hope I'm coming across here. I've got a question, and I hope that I can articulate it well enough so that you can understand what I'm asking. And it's along the lines of the dehumanization of us. And so my question is, what's your opinion about, as we as a species have evolved and to the point where we've got political orientations and we're left and right, and as we've matured as a country, that has evolved too. What effect does our political environment today might play in this whole dehumanization, where my thinking is right and you're absolutely wrong, and it plays out in a political space? You just use the word politicalization in one way. So where does politics come into all of this? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, in our culture today, the politics does seem to be making a huge impact, and there's this push for this polarization. One thing I noted in the book that I mentioned, the very first, where it defined humanization, I didn't read further into it, but they also used another term, otherization. And I think what happens along dehumanization lines is we gain this idea that of the separation, that the more dehumanized we get, just like it can be something like, oh, that's a vegetable or that's a fetus, so I can justify what I need to do with that. But I think this otherization idea, we get so involved, that's them, this is us. We become more and more separated, and I think all people across worldviews and races and everyone have fed into this. To me, I see, or it seems to me, that continued approach where we can hardly dialogue anymore. I mean, thank goodness John can dialogue with this woman next month. We don't allow that dialogue anymore. We have this real separation, and it's that seeing the others as lesser than, so we can hold our view. So where I see politics fitting into that is kind of almost like maybe a vicious cycle, and anyone can disagree or whatever, is we fed that otherization, that dehumanization, so now you don't have the same view I have, and so we're making that more of a sensitive or aggressive kind of separation, and we see that craziness, and then that aggressiveness then just keeps that cycle going, where, okay, because you don't agree with me, I'm going to treat you this way, and I'm going to defame your character, and I'm going to do whatever, even if it has no sound evidential basis to do this. So to me, I see it as a vicious cycle. Does that answer?
Thank you.
Question?
Yes, it does.
Yeah. Okay.
Hey, Amy, great to see you back
Yeah.
in town, and great to see what your passion has taken you to. And it seems like you could probably test out of that PhD, maybe just get it.
Okay, thank you. We just let them know. And
Two questions. So, being in the medical profession and having dealt with, for example, organ harvesting, which is done not infrequently at some of my hospitals. Certainly, just to clarify, sometimes we do use medications which could be interpreted as preventing pain, but there's a physiologic response that goes along with pain stimulation, whether or not it's being processed by the brain, and that has detrimental effects on the organs. So sometimes it is done for that purpose, for the organ harvesting purpose, rather than the actual pain processing that takes place.
Yeah.
But I've seen, and I see it as potentially dehumanizing, in a way, but at the same time, I've seen such a powerful impact on what we can do with organ harvesting in certain situations. Tragic events take place, motor vehicle accidents happen, a young man, young woman is killed, and their family wants to provide their organs to another individual. To see what happens to the life of the individual who receives that organ, and frankly, sometimes I see it as a turning point in their life where they look at things differently, and that potentially has kingdom impact. So just wondered about your thoughts on organ harvesting and the potential balance that may be present there, such that yes, there's potential dehumanizing, but yes, there's power. Do you agree with that? And then I have one more question.
I do agree with that, and I do very much appreciate you bringing that up, because I want to make sure that there's a balance. And that's where ethical issues are difficult, because even in the gene editing, someone may say, but I have this issue, and this could be very helpful with this, or I have this family member who has this, and can we go there with this? And so I think in maybe not all the areas, but in some of the areas, like you mentioned, the organ harvesting, there are those foreseeable, like this could be of value that we have figured out that this can be done. And so right now, I don't have an answer to it, but I think it just means that more, if we don't handle it carefully, then they do get carried out of hand. So because we've legalized it for some need, we still need to have, like you say, technology is ahead of the ethics. So we still need to have this where we're not seeing it as utilitarian and throwing away. You have in China now, they're using this for much like forcing political prisoners to give up organs, and so it's becoming that further. So I do agree there could be definitely some value, whether there may be alternatives or anything like that. I'm not as steeped, in medical community, and probably not as much as you are, but I think those are things that need to be addressed definitely in some of these areas.
So just to clarify, the process itself, actually, the organ harvesting process, I find very uncomfortable and
Yes.
almost dehumanizing.
Yeah.
In that sense, but the ramifications, what can be accomplished, is where I see a potential need for balance, because we can, change people's lives, and
Yes.
they themselves can change. The other question I had was with regards to the violence, the crime that we see in our culture and seemingly increased. Do you see that being in part because of the dehumanization of our secular culture?
Well, that's a great question. That's something I would like to look more into. I think that definitely is a dehumanization, because again, seeing someone as less than, I've noticed just on small levels, and maybe it's just me, but I've gone, this is a minor point, gone shoe shopping for my grandson a couple days. And both times I've driven to the outlets, I've had people, it was more than just, oh, they cut me off, whatever. And I try to be patient. I know I'm sometimes scattered and make mistakes and can cut someone off in traffic unintentionally. But there were some blatant, I mean, this isn't even violence. There were some blatant, or this person, I could have almost hit them, and I was moving in a lane, and they just decided they're going to cut across, and she honked at me for cutting, and she wasn't even, it just, like, I noticed some in little ways where people in our culture in some areas, it's like very blatant, not even accidental, or, oh, I just trying to get through. It's a very blatant, no, I'm looking out for number one, and I'm going to do, whether it makes you, I was walking across a lane in the parking lot with my grandson, and another vehicle was flying right in front of the shops, was going way faster than anyone should attempt to go in any parking lot or neighborhood road. And I think in all the culture and it leads to that violence, just a dehumanization, and I would think ultimately is impactful by just culturally handing down what we see in media, what we experience in political polarization. It's just, again, that disregard for other human life. How tight those connections are, I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Very depressing, but thanks for ending with that scripture. We do have hope, right?
Yeah.
My question is this, like, as I talk to my atheist friends, one of the things that I see more and more when I try to say a human being is a combination of body and mind, like material and immaterial, there's always a pushback on that. Oh, it's just a lump of cells like that. And I see that's what prompting that reductionism. But do you have any arguments? And I know it's a self-evident truth, but in your experience, when we talk to others, is there anything that we can give a little more to show that, or do you have any to illustrate that point that human beings are, a combination of body and mind?
That's a great question. I'm trying to think now. It's been a bit, trying to think of even resources to tell you. There is, so I did bring up the book, Non-Computable Use. So Dr. Robert Marks, he was a professor at Baylor. I'm not sure if he's still there, retired. He works with Discovery Institute and works in their area of human exceptionalism. I would use that as a resource as far as there's a philosopher, J.P. Moreland. I can write these down for you later that addresses that. That could probably give you even a better answer than I can. But there's definitely a lot of just evidential support for the fact that we are immaterial and material. Yeah, for some reason I'm not coming up with any great thing. There are great things. It's just not popping to the top of my head at the moment. But I can write those sources down for you. Yes, when we're done. Thank you for that.
So Dr. Robert Marks, who was a professor at Baylor, spoke to our chapter during the pandemic. His video is on our YouTube channel. It's not even live, because that was during the pandemic when we were doing it remotely. So if you click on the live button, then we'll pull up his video. Yeah. Next question over here.
First of all, congratulations on a great presentation.
Oh,
There's a real wake-up call to what's going on around us. When you're not on stage giving talks on this, you're a student going for a graduate degree in a Christian university. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what you're seeing with your professors and the other academics in the community, in that community. How are they responding to this? Is it all's good, we got this covered? Is this, uh-oh, we got some work to do? How are they, what are your observations about how the Christian thought leaders are responding to this?
Okay, great question. So yes, I am a student working on Master's in Science and Religion because I want to move more into just the area of apologetics and working in that field. I'm currently also a high school science teacher, so it keeps me busy as well. So the specific classes I've had in my degree haven't necessarily targeted this area specifically. It's been as I've moved more and more to the apologetics field and just as I've lived more and more in culture, it's been something very much on my heart because just experiences in my own life and whatnot, this a degrading of other humans in personal circles and wider cultural circles. I know I ended up using, I realized how much I use this Wesley Smith. There's also another organization that I'm connected with, in addition to Reasons to Believe, is Discovery Institute. And he is a part of Discovery Institute. And so I've come to start listening to him more. I didn't realize that there is a field of apologetics and human exceptionalism, and he is apparently a foremost apologist in that field. So that's who I've listened to, is some leaders there that aren't necessarily connected with my graduate program per se. And what I get the feel of there is we are in trouble. So I don't want to leave with I didn't want this to be depressing. I think wake-up call is important, and for me it was important. I tend to be one that doesn't like conflict, that wants to kind of think everything's okay, let's just live life and be happy and love people around us. But there are a lot of people suffering around us because I think many of us want to live like that. And so I think it's important to address these issues. But we live in a fallen world, but even though we live in a fallen world, we have to remember we do have hope. And the hope is that we can, and I think it's an exciting thing to think that we can bring truth and hope to those who are suffering, even if it means a little pushback against people that won't be so friendly to that.
Yeah,
Yes.
Amy, a wonderful presentation. Gosh, I just appreciated the preparation. It was awesome. The question I've got is we learned about how artificial intelligence is just going to be exponential. I mean, imagine what it could be 20 or 30 years from now, what kind of environment we're going to be in. So as Christians, do we, in order to maybe compete in that world, to what extent do we embrace this technology? And to some extent, the dehumanization that's going to occur? Or do you feel that we need to kind of get off the grid of artificial intelligence and be intentional on, no, we're not going to embrace it, and we'll suffer the consequences or benefit from what we do? Just curious, what's your view on where the future holds for folks that are really concerned about AI and how we perform in that world?
That is a great question. I think, as many things, we hold it loosely, and we remember that AI is a tool, and a tool can be used for good or bad. And there's a couple people that I like to listen to when it comes to AI to figure that out. John Lennox, if anyone's familiar with him, has some good things to say about how to handle AI, as well as Dr. Robert Marks that I've talked about. And then through them, you listen to them, you can get some other resources. Sort of a brief that I would think is, I don't think we necessarily need to embrace it in all its fullness as far as what culture is going to embrace it. But I don't think that going off grid is, well, yeah, that would be great. Let's avoid all the, I don't think that's the answer, and I don't think that's a way to have influence in culture. I think we use it for a tool that it's wise to use it for, and that may look different in different circles. but that we do stand up, or that we do, I think it's important in our responsibility to be educated enough on it to know what is being done. And as far as AI itself and moving exponentially, if you listen to particularly Dr. Robert Marks, who's very steeped in the technology, and others, there's not as much fear as some people think, like it's going to take over. Because again, AI it's all algorithmic. It can be used as a tool to weaponize, but AI itself is not going to suddenly, these robots turn into Frankensteins that are going to come after us. So I think our responsibility is to be updated, be educated, and then just use it as a tool for whatever our personal. Does that make sense? Is that? Oh.
Obviously, you've never seen the movie Terminator.
I
So,
know.
question over here.
Oh yeah.
Oh, hey, I'm Janie.
Hi.
Great talk. My question is, I come from a background and church being very Bible-based. I don't want to go to a church that's not preaching out of God's word, specifically everything from Genesis to Revelation.
Yeah.
And when you were talking about the transhumanism, dehumanism in the church, can you clarify to me kind of what areas, so like as a believer, I can be more aware of where you see it in depth in the church? Dehumanization, because you kind of mentioned it.
Oh, okay. So maybe where I said it's for instance, the views that have impacted, so the Baconianism idea in the church or in evangelicalism, as well as there's one other, I just went blank. But yeah, I think for that is just what I intended with that is just to be careful ourselves. Oftentimes, Christians in the church, we do want to, we have this us and them thought as far as culture and the world goes. Oh, because we're human, we want to be comfortable too. And we want to be around people who agree with us, we can live comfortably around. And we've fed into that fact-value split, for instance, where there's been, not in all churches, but there has been a trend since revivals too with that anti-intellectualism, where we've sort of backed down from being at the forefront of culture with being educated and being able to address cultural issues. And I just think, and churches are doing this today, I just think it's very important as believers that if we're going to have any impact on society and those around us, it's not trying to make our voices loud and compete in the political scene necessarily, as it is to become educated as far as how can we show culture that objective truth is a solid foundation upon which culture will thrive. And I think it's the church's responsibility to educate believers in that, rather than keeping ourselves separate from. Does that make sense? Okay.
We'll make this last question. David, I think, has a.
Okay, sure. I always have a question, and this was came into my mind. First comment, a short comment, John. A great dissertation topic would be the dehumanization of watching Disney movies. I've spent 13 years with my daughter watching Disney movies. That's my life for 13 years. And then I have nieces and nephews and great nieces and nephews that's what we do is watch Disney movies. And so I've seen that heavily fit a lot of your talk here, and I can point to a movie that heavily helped the view that you talked about there. So that would be a good dissertation topic. Maybe since your grandkids, you can sort of be working on a dissertation as you're watching this.
There you go.
So the question is, as you spoke, I thought of a lot of the old religions, the older ones, maybe Hinduism and Taoism and some other ones that had a lot of dehumanization aspects from ancient past. So are we just going back to some of that in a way that we used to have Greek mythology and worship animal gods and do certain things that we used to do as humans early on, and now we're going back to some kind of sophisticated variation of that. Do you see that in any of your studies and investigations?
That's an interesting point. That has not come up in my studies at this point. It'd be interesting to pursue that. But I have thought about that just at some point in my own head, as far as that sophistication of gods with the whole AI and transhumanism. I don't know a lot of detail on it, but you can look it up online. There's AI church or transhumanist church. So it does seem to be a religious pursuit in building gods such as the Greek gods. And I think that humans, we have a desire to worship. And so we may worship other humans, celebrities, whatever. We also may create our own gods, however that looks. And I think that with the AI and all that is, to me, it does seem like it could have a link. I haven't necessarily come up with articles on that or studies, yeah.
One of the things I'd add to that is oftentimes the church is not about worship, the church is about power. So a lot of people, they connect and organize with church because they want the power. They see that as a way to.
Good point, yeah.
Thank you, Amy. That was wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.